A Jewish Embassy to Emperor Caligula. Welcome to Ancient World Studies. My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. In one of my previous video lectures, some of you asked what foreign envoys might have experienced when they met the Roman emperors. Direct witness evidence survives from this era, and it indicates how the Emperor Caligula behaved in front of envoys from subject nations. The Emperor Caligula, known in antiquity as Gaius, was reviled in later accounts as uniquely cruel and unpredictable. These accounts often focus on crucial incidents in his life that changed the course of political events or demonstrated the emperor's erratic or oppressive character. It is therefore interesting to read a contemporary account describing what must have been a routine encounter for the head of the Roman state. The source for this account is a prominent Alexandrian Jew named Philo, who lived in the 1st century AD. Philo was a philosopher who was heavily influenced by Greek culture and wrote treatises on political subjects. In this era, Egypt was a Roman province, subject to a governor who administered the territory from the capital, Alexandria. Alexandria was a mainly Greek city that had been founded in the 4th century BC by Alexander the Great and the Ptolemaic dynasty, which succeeded to power in Egypt. But the city was also home to a large Jewish community that numbered in the tens of thousands. By the 1st century AD, Alexandria probably had an urban population of over 500,000 people. This made it the second largest city in the Roman Empire and an important concern for the imperial government. Vast quantities of grain were shipped from Egypt to Rome, and this traffic was conducted through the docks in Alexandria. The Jewish historian Josephus suggests that Alexandria managed about 1/3 of grain shipments that fed Rome. This included a large share of the grain dole that the government issued free to Roman citizens in the capital. But Alexandria was also at the centre of the ancient world economy, and its merchants managed incoming imports from the Indian Ocean arriving via the Red Sea. The profits from this commerce were immense, and the custom taxes collected by imperial agents greatly enriched the Roman regime. Josephus records a speech made by the Jewish king Herod Agrippa to his kinsmen. Herod Agrippa states, "Look at Roman power in our nearest neighbour Egypt. Egypt reaches to Ethiopia and Arabia Felix, and it is support for India. Egypt has a powerful incentive to revolt because of Alexandria, a city of great size, population and wealth. Alexandria is 3.5 miles long and over a mile wide. It pays Rome every month more tribute than you pay in a year, and sends Rome enough grain to feed the city for 4 months of the year." Jewish people were involved in these business enterprises, including the brother of Philo, who was named Tiberius Julius Alexander. Josephus records that Tiberius Alexander was a prominent Jewish businessman, an alabarch, in charge of collecting import taxes at Alexandria. This income made Tiberius Alexander extremely influential, and he might have been the Alexander mentioned in the New Testament when the apostles Peter and John began their ministry in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. Josephus reports that Alexander paid for gold-plated decorations to embellish the 9 gates that led into the Jewish temple complex in Jerusalem. Tiberius Alexander used his profits to give his eldest son a political career in imperial service and to establish his younger son Marcus as a leading businessman. Receipts from a Greek transport firm record how goods were transferred by camel caravan from the Nile river port of Koptos across the eastern desert to the Red Sea harbour towns engaged in trade with India. These transport records, scratched on pottery tokens, ostraca, belong to a collection known as a Nicanor archive. The archive reveals that Marcus had commercial agents at Koptos and in the main Red Sea ports. In Myos Hormos, he used a free agent named Saturnaenos and a slave managed his business at Berenike. Marcus was sending ships to India and trading along the sea lanes described in the merchant handbook called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. But despite their wealth and influence, the Jewish community in Alexandria were under threat. Certain elements in the Greek population wanted to provoke a conflict, and they used the imperial cult to further their aims. They erected statues of the emperors in Jewish areas and claimed them to be divine images of gods. This was considered idolatry, and these statues could not be tolerated in Jewish sacred spaces. The Roman governor did not intervene to rectify the situation, and as tensions escalated, there were attacks on Jewish properties, households, and synagogues in the city. It was even rumoured that the Emperor Caligula was planning to install a statue of himself as a god in the great Jewish temple at Jerusalem. Immediate action was required to prevent the outbreak of more serious violence. Philo and his brother Tiberius Alexander therefore prepared to lead a political delegation to Rome. They would speak for their community and persuade the emperor not to impose the imperial cult on the Jews in Alexandria and their kinsmen in Judea. When the envoys arrived in Rome, they were briefly introduced to the emperor as he strolled through some imperial properties surrounded by a large entourage of guards and attendants. Caligula addressed them directly, and in a quick formal response he gave them hope that they might soon receive a full audience that would resolve their concerns. However, the envoys were kept waiting in Rome for many weeks, without news regarding when they might have the opportunity to plead their cause. During this long interval, the envoys became increasingly despondent and disturbed by reports concerning the character of the emperor. In particular, Philo feared that rival Greek and Egyptian representatives from Alexandria might use flattery to persuade the emperor to reject Jewish appeals. The following reading is an extract from the account of the mission written by Philo. In the account, Caligula is known by his official name, Gaius.
These are the words of Philo, the leader of the delegation to Caligula. Now the Emperor Gaius was a man who was neither stable nor trustworthy. Such was his nature that, even if he did anything good or kind, he immediately regretted it. As soon as possible he would try to cancel out his good deed, but in such a way as to cause even greater suffering and injury to those who he had inadvertently favoured. For instance, when he released some prisoners, for no reason whatsoever, he threw them back into prison for the second time. This inflicted upon them a punishment more dreadful than the first imprisonment, because it was an unexpected misfortune. Yet again, Gaius condemned to banishment some men who were expecting the death sentence from him. These men expected death, not because they knew they had committed crimes deserving of death. They had done nothing that merited any punishment at all, not even the slightest, but just because death was demanded by the excessive inhumanity of their emperor. Now, to these men, banishment was a downright gain. It was almost equal to a reinstatement, since they had escaped the greatest of all evils, the danger of death. These men were the most admirable and nobly born of exiles. They were bearing their misfortune in the most contented manner, living in a different island as though they were in their own countries. But in no time at all, even though no new circumstances had arisen, Gaius sent some soldiers after them and had them all put to death simultaneously. In this way, Gaius inflicted the greatest and most contemptible and unexpected misery on many of the noblest families in Rome. And if ever Gaius gave anyone a sum of money as a gift, he demanded it back again at some future time, but not as though it were a simple loan. No, Gaius required interest and compound interest. He often treated the people who had received the money as if they were thieves, and punished them with the severest of penalties for having stolen the funds. He was not satisfied that these miserable men should return what had been given to them, but he compelled them to also give up all the property they had inherited from their parents, or relations, or from friends, even property they had acquired by their own resources from a life of industry and profit. Even those who seemed to be in favour with Gaius, and who were, with a great appearance of friendship and goodwill, around him while he pursued continual pleasures, they were also greatly injured by him. They were compelled to spend large sums in sudden, irregular, and often unlawful journeys and entertainments. These people spent the entire value of entire properties on the preparation of a single lavish banquet. They had to turn to moneylenders. So vast was Gaius' wastefulness that many men were dissuaded from receiving any favours from him, thinking it was of no advantage. It was only a bait and a snare to lead them into intolerable suffering. His behaviour was disproportionate towards everyone, but especially he was most bitterly hostile towards the nation of Jews. Starting in Alexandria, then in other cities, he took all their synagogues and filled them with images and statues of himself. He didn't care about imposing any other thing but his own statue, and this was installed by force. But the great temple of the Jews in their holy city, he left that until last. Now, you might think that such a place was worthy of all possible respect and preservation. But Gaius wanted to alter it and transform it into a temple of his own. He planned to call it the Temple of the New Jupiter, the illustrious Gaius. Oh, what's that you say, Gaius? Do you, who are a man, seek to take dominion of the air and of the heavens? Are you not content with the vast multitudes of continents and islands and nations and countries over which you already enjoy sovereignty? And do you not think about any one of the gods who are worshipped in that holy city? Never mind he who is worshipped by our own people. Oh, those gods are worthy of any country, or city, or even of any small precinct which may have been consecrated to them in olden times. These gods have had dedications to them with oracles and sacred hymns. Are you intending to deprive them of that? Are you intending that in all the vast circumference of the world there will be no visible trace or memorial to be found anywhere of honour or pious worship paid to the true, real, living God. Ah, Gaius, truly you are suggesting fine hopes for the race of mankind. Are you ignorant of the fact that you are opening the fountains of evil of every kind by making such innovations and committing acts of audacious impiety? Ugh, it is wicked to even think of this, never mind do it. It might be worthwhile to make mention here of what we saw and heard when we were sent for by Gaius to argue on behalf of our national constitution. Well, from the moment that we entered the presence of the emperor, we could see from his looks and from the state of agitation he was in that we had not come before a judge, but before an accuser. Or maybe I should say, before the open enemy of anybody who believed he was opposed to his will. Now, if the emperor had taken the part of a judge, he would have sat with assessors, men selected because of their virtue and learning. When a question of the greatest importance was being investigated, something which had lain dormant for 400 years and was now being raised for the first time amongst very many Alexandrian Jews, surely it would have been proper for the contending parties to stand on each side of the emperor with their advocates, and for him to listen to them, each in turn. Firstly, he should listen to the accusation, and then to the defense, each according to the same time period as measured by water or something like the sand in our hourglass. Then the judge should retire to deliberate with his advisers as to what he ought to publicly deliver as his sentence on the justice of the case. But what actually happened more resembled the conduct of a merciless tyrant, one who exhibits uncontrolled authority and shows displeasure and pride. Gaius in no way behaved in the manner which I have just been describing as being proper for a judge. He sent for the managers of two gardens, the Mycentian and the Lamian garden. They're near one another, close to the city. And this was the place where he staged his theatrical spectacle, aimed at the enjoyment of the whole nation and lasting 3 or 4 days. He intended for it to be enacted in our presence. He commanded all the outer buildings to be opened for him so that he could examine them minutely. Well, as soon as we were introduced into his presence, the moment we saw him, we bent to the ground with all imaginable respect and adoration. We saluted him in a gentle, courteous, and humane manner, calling him the Emperor Augustus. But when he answered, we not only despaired of obtaining our adjective, we even wondered if we could save our own lives. Gaius said, "You are haters of God, in that you do not think that I am a god. I am already confessed to be a god by every other nation, Ah, but I am refused that appellation by you. And then, stretching up his hands to heaven, he uttered a sudden, forceful exclamation, which was sacrilege to hear. It would be even more so if I were to repeat it word for word. And immediately, all the representatives of the opposite faction were filled with unimaginable delight, on account of these being the first words uttered by Gaius. They thought that their embassy was already successful. So they clapped their hands, they danced for joy, and they called him by every single title which can be applied to any one of the gods. Well, while Gaius was triumphing in these superhuman names, the flatterer, Isidorus, seeing that the mood that the emperor was in, said, "O master, you will hate and pour violence on these men who you see before you, and also on their fellow countrymen. You have been made acquainted with their disaffection and disloyalty towards yourself, when all other men were offering up sacrifices of thanksgiving for your safety. Only these men refuse to offer any sacrifice at all. And when I say these men, I mean all the rest of the Jews." So we all cried out together, "Oh, Lord Gaius, we're falsely accused. We did sacrifice, and we offered up large-scale sacrifices, entire hecatombs. We poured blood in a libation upon the altar, and we did not carry the flesh of the sacred animals back to our homes to feast and banquet upon it, as some people are accustomed to do. We committed the whole beast to the sacred flame as a burnt offering. And we have done this, not just once, but 3 times already. The first was when you succeeded to the empire. The second time was when you recovered from that terrible disease, when the whole entire habitable world was afflicted at the same time. And the third time we sacrificed was in the hope of your victory over the Germans." He said. "I grant you," he said, "that all this is true, and that you did sacrifice. But nevertheless, you were sacrificing on my behalf to another god. You weren't sacrificing to me. So why was that good for me?" Immediately, the minute we heard this, a profound trembling came over us. It was similar to the fear that had overwhelmed us when we first came into his presence. But while he was saying all this, he was going into the outer buildings. He examined the chambers of the men, and then those of the women. And then he inspected the rooms on the ground floor, and then all the apartments in the upper story. And as he did so, he was blaming some detail of their preparation as being defective. He was recommending planning alterations and suggesting designs and giving orders to make the buildings more expensive. And we were forced to follow him, up and down and through the whole place. And all the time we were being mocked and ridiculed by our adversaries. It was like characters acting in a theatre play, like a kind of farce. It was as though Gaius, as the judge, had assumed the part of an accuser. And the accusers, well, they were playing the part of an unjust judge, one who looked upon the defendants with an eye of hostility and acted in accordance against the nature of truth. And if a judge invested with such mighty power begins to reproach the person who is on trial before him, it is necessary for that person to be silent. It's entirely possible to defend oneself, even in silence. Especially so for people who are trying to understand the topic that Gaius was investigating. And sure, we had nothing to say about them anyway. Besides, for the sake of our laws and our customs, we held our tongues and we shut our mouths. When Gaius had given his orders about the buildings, he asked us a very important and solemn question. Why is it that you abstain from eating pig's flesh? At this question, such violent laughter was raised by our adversaries. Now, this was partly because they were really delighted, and partly because they wished to flatter the emperor. They wished to make it appear that this question was dictated by wit and uttered by grace. Even some of the servants that were following Gaius were indignant at them because they seemed to be treating the emperor with so little respect. After all, it is not safe for his most intimate friends to so much as smile at his words. But we answered, different nations have different laws. Nonetheless, there are some things which are forbidden, both to us and to our adversaries. And then someone said, oh yes, there are many people who do not eat lamb's flesh, which is the tenderest meat of all. And the emperor laughed. And he said, you're quite right. It's not a bit nice. And being joked with and ridiculed in this manner caused us great confusion. At last the emperor said, in a rapid and commanding manner, I desire to know what principles of justice you recognize with regard to your constitution. So we began to reply to him and explain it to him. And no sooner had he got some idea of our case on the principles of justice than he began to see that our arguments were not disreputable. But before we could bring forward the more important things which we had to say, he cut us short. He ran forward, he burst into the principal building and commanded that the windows around it should be filled up with transparent glass. He wanted glass pebbles, very much resembling white crystal, which do not hinder the light, but which would keep out the wind and the heat of the sun. And then, proceeding on, he deliberately asked us in a more moderate tone, sorry, what was it you were saying? And when we began to repeat what we had already said, he again ran on and went into another house. And this time he commanded some ancient and admirable pictures to be placed there. So our pleadings on behalf of justice were broken up and cut short and interrupted and crushed. We were weary, we were exhausted, and we had no strength left in us. We were in continual expectation of nothing else than death, and could no longer keep up our courage. In our agony, we took refuge in the one true God, praying to check the wrath of this false so-called God. Then Gaius took compassion on us, and he turned his mind towards pitying us. He became pacified and merely said, "Oh, these men do not appear to me to be wicked. They are unfortunate and foolish, because they do not believe that I have been endowed with the nature of a god." And with that, he dismissed us, and he commanded us to depart. We had escaped from what was more like a theatre or a prison than a court of justice. In a theatre, there is a great deal of noise, and people are hissing and groaning and ridiculing the actors in an extravagant manner. While in a prison, there would be many blows inflicted on our bodies, and tortures. These would be the things to agitate our whole souls because of the blasphemies which those around us would utter against our deity. Such were the threats which were breathed forth against us, and which the emperor himself breathed forth with such vehemence. He was indignant with us, not on behalf of anyone else, for in that case he soon could have been appeased. He was indignant for himself and his great desire to be declared a god. He considered that the Jews were the only people who did not acquiesce and who were unable to subscribe to his deity. We at last recovered our breath. It wasn't because we'd been afraid of death, simply because we wanted to live. Oh no. We would have cheerfully embraced death because our laws and our customs would have conferred immortality upon us by such means. No. It was because we knew that if we were killed, it would be a great dishonour, for we had not achieved any desirable outcome for our people. Whatever insults envoys are subjected to are at all times referred back to those who sent them. And due to these considerations, we were able to hold our heads up for a while. But there were other circumstances which terrified us and kept us in great confusion and distress. We were still waiting to hear what the emperor would decide, what he would say, and what kind of sentence he would ultimately deliver. He had heard the general sense of our arguments, although he had contempt for some of our facts. We became overwhelmed with this problem, and in our misery we vexed ourselves with such thoughts as these. Would it not now be a terrible thing for the interests of all the Jews throughout the whole world to be thrown into uncertainty by the treatment to which we, its 5 envoys, were exposed? For if we were not to be given up to our enemies, in what other city could we enjoy tranquility? In what city would the citizens not attack the Jews living there? What synagogue would be left undamaged? What state would not overturn every principle of justice in favour of their countrymen who had grouped together in opposition to the national laws and customs of the Jews? Oh, the Jews will be overthrown. They will be shipwrecked, and they will be sent to the bottom of the sea. And this will be done in agreement with all the particular laws of the nation, along with those laws which are common to all, and in accord with the principles of justice, which should be recognized in every city. But then, even those who had, up until this time, seemed to cooperate with us, they were now tired of taking our part. Therefore, when we called them forward, they were inside, or they hadn't stayed, but came out secretly in fear. They knew full well the desire the emperor had to be looked upon as a god. Well, I have now related in a concise and summary manner the cause of the hatred of the Emperor Gaius to the whole nation of the Jews. Now, we have to retract all that we have just said in order to compose a poem, a formal withdrawal palinode to Gaius.
This is how the account of the embassy led by Philo ends. The team returned to Alexandria to give an account of their mission, but Tiberius Alexander did not accompany them. Philo was forced to leave his brother in Rome as a political hostage to guarantee compliance amongst the Jewish community in Alexandria. 3 years later, in AD 41, the despised Emperor Caligula was assassinated, and the Praetorian Guard selected Claudius as the new head of the Roman state. For further information, please see my books on the ancient economy. Subscribe to this channel. Like and share this video. Click on the link below. Thank you.